Good evening, Hillmantok students. I am sorry that this is even later than I said. When I got home Monday, I just fell right asleep and woke up, and it was Tuesday. I had to go back to work before recording. So it is now Tuesday evening, so which means that the resources and everything will be on the website no later than Wednesday evening. It's usually a day behind because it takes me a minute to set that all up. Um, but I do appreciate you still tapping in. I'm Shakima Funches, if you haven't known. This is our continued discussion on AAVE and its role in education. We're going to be exploring how educational policies impact recognition and the use of AAVE in academic spaces and the broader strategic impact for or implications for students, educators, policymakers. So in this discussion, we're going to be looking at the historic AAVE in education, including key legal decisions and policy shifts. We're going to examine some current policies and how that impacts such AAVE speakers through standardized testing, curriculum design, and teacher training. And then we will follow up by talking about some strategic implications and how that can affect linguistic inclusivity and improve educational outcomes. Finally, we're going to analyze some challenges and opportunities in further shaping language policies and how they can become more equitable and effective. I'm going to give you a second to look over the brief definitions list. And as we move throughout the presentation, I do encourage you to circle back and think critically about the following. What are your thoughts on AAVE's recognition in education? And how have your encounters been in academic settings? Have they gone well? This is going to be our lesson map, and we're going to be looking, like I said, at historical context of AAVE, educational policies, strategic impact, and strategic recommendations to be addressed over time. Starting with historical context. The debates regarding AAVE have played out in classrooms, courtrooms, and school board meetings. As we talked about in the 1970 Ann Arbor decision, Judge Joyner's court held that when teaching Black children to read, the school board must adjust to children's dialect and not force children to adjust to the school. By ignoring students' home language, teachers were inadvertently contributing to those students having reading difficulties. And so the court ruled that the district had to remedy this in two key mandates. One, they had to identify which children spoke AAVE, and two, they had to provide in-service training for teachers on AAVE's linguistic features to ensure that they could strategize to teach standard English as a second dialect. So in practice, it meant that teachers needed to learn how AAVE differed from standard English to ensure that they could better understand and better teach reading without devaluing the student's home language or speech. And so this was the first time a court had addressed AAVE's influences in academic achievement and effectively recognized AAVE as a factor the schools had to consider, reigniting the debate about difference versus deficit in linguistics and in education. Many educators, we stated, had assumed that non-standard speech was a sign of intellectual or verbal deficiency, and the court had now challenged that. Scholars would note that this case forced educators to rethink their attitudes, particularly about AAVE being inferior and lowering expectations for AAVE speaking students. Because when the teachers overcorrected them, so research or misunderstood, it resulted in less direct instruction and reduced expectations for their success. And so Ann Arbor prompted school districts, especially in Michigan, to start providing a dialectical training program and to develop ways and methods to train students from AAVE to standard English in a more supportive way. And so while it did stop short of declaring AAVE as an outright separate language, it did cautiously endorse it and started towards the role of its legitimacy fully in educational spaces. It showed that AAVE can no longer be ignored when considering educational policies. In the years after, we see conferences and workshops where educators and linguists have to come together to better discuss how to meet African American students' language needs. And so this scholarship grows out of it that starts to talk about, how do you understand standard American English in relation to AAVE? And so Ann Arbor really set that ruling, set the precedence for more dialectical awareness in creating educational equality opportunities. And so we then fast forward to the 1996 Ebonics resolution. And so that recognizes that the language patterns of students' primary language and offered instruction to the teachers on how to enrich and legitimize that language to help students master standard English. And so, in more practical terms, it starts off this understanding of the bridge method. To teach standard American English, you have to understand AAVE. And so, the board even instructed the superintendent to seek federal bilingual educational funds to support these programs that they were going to roll out, implying that AAVE should be considered similar to a second language for educational purposes. And there was a lot of backlash, as we discussed. And, you know, the Oakland resolution brought up what had gone on in the 1980 programs in Los Angeles, and, understanding that, you know, we need to move forward and kind of push this needle. Despite people like Reverend Jesse Jackson, he did soften his stance later, but denouncing it. Kwesi Mafube of the NAACP was also very critical of it. This outrage that stemmed from it forced them in 1997, January to be exact. It was about a month after the resolution had first been mentioned and approved by the board. They had to amend it to clarify their intent. And under this revised policy, they removed some such wording as such as the genetically predisposition of African American students to AAVE, and they were trying to shift the focus away from all of this mislabeling about what the stance was AAVE in relation to standard American English, and push it and reframe it as an initiative, which was the whole intent the whole time, but towards professional development efforts. Saying teachers should learn about the dialect to better understand teaching standard literacy to this set of students. And so, despite its controversy in places where it was accepted, it did have long lasting positive effects. And it also brought national attention to the academic challenges that AAVE students face. So the idea of code switching begins to arise more and more in classrooms. And, in the wake of the Educational Opportunities 2006, California's Curriculum Commission encourages students and schools to meet in the middle and offer more additional support through phonological contrast, through grammar differences, and it's mobilizing linguistic efforts to take a stance. So you'll see societies like the Linguistic Society of America start talking and, putting out these referendums and putting out these public messages about linguistical and pedagogical sound, and why it's important to ensure that, the legacy that schools have, the diversity that they push, is going to be standing on the right side of history through teacher training and understanding language differences. Beyond Ann Arbor and Oakland, there are also several policy milestones that also influence AAVE, how it's perceived, and how it's integrated into schools. So you have the 1974 landmark resolution, students' rights to their own language. And this early policy set the tone for professional in how to understand equal opportunity to learn regardless of dialect. And it lays the groundwork for other educational inquiries that require valuing the student's home language. So you look at linguists such as Joe Barrett and Roger Shue, who then start to push the bridge reading program, and that starts around the 1969s and continues on, and it positions instructional materials that help the ease of transition to standard rate and to standard American English. Prior to Oakland's resolution, again, we talk about Los Angeles as, launching their language development program for African American students, also known as LDPAAS, and that was in 1988. And it was a district-wide program that tried to teach AAVE speakers akin to bilingual students, using William Stewart's standard English as a second dialect. And this initiative, even though early on and faced a lot of political and social resistance, was short-lived, but did start to foreshadow the debates to come and the ground that would need to be covered to ensure awareness of AAVE and how you can have policies that positively influence it. So the California Curriculum Commission explicitly had recommended, phonics and grammar support for AV students. When you look at the national education policies, such as No Child Left Behind, 2001, the Common Core standards, these don't specifically address AVE, but they do emphasize closing achievement gaps. And so it indirectly starts pressuring schools to consider more factors like how dialect can impact literacy education. You do have, conversely, other things working in the background that do try to stand as a barrier to AV as a separate language. In 1997, the United States Education Secretary Richard Riley says that no bilingual federal education fund should be redirected for Imani, should be used for AV policies. And so this again is pushing the needle the opposite way as we try to work towards a more legitimacy for AVE and try to help, um, you know, find a way to de-alienate and destigmatize AV's use in schooling. So it is going to be an ongoing effort as we work to try to create a more affirming environment for AV speakers. And students who see their language is respected tend to have more pride in it. They're going to participate more. So that's why that biodialectical approach is very important in, assisting with the struggles for cultural recognition and equity in the educational spaces. We see these recent attacks that happen under the current regime trying to dismantle inclusive policies and pedagogies. And so that's why it's super crucial that we work towards avoid sacrificing the progress that we already have made on these fronts. And so we see with these historical cases how policies on AVE are shaped by the legal decisions and cultural debates. And we also see that the policies can also influence when they're ignored in academic settings. So, No Child Left Behind, the Common Core standards stand on one side, but then you also have the culturally responsive teaching and other pedagogical strategies such as code switching and translanguaging that positively impact AAVE. So as I mentioned, No Child Left Behind Act and Common Core standards were set up, No Child Left Behind was 2001, but was set up to improve student performances by holding schools accountable for the standardized test scores. And so it didn't initially speak specifically about AVE, but it did talk about closing achievement gaps. However, when applied, it does disproportionately affect students who speak non-standard dialects because standardized testing is based heavily on standard American English, which means that AAV speakers are at a disadvantage because of certain things that are marked as errors that don't necessarily impact the actual language proficiency. And so it doesn't really acknowledge dialectal variation because of that formal academic English that it's looking to recognize and adhere to. By reinforcing this, they reinforce the deficit model, where AV is seen as a problem to be corrected rather than the bridge literacy that we saw educators trying to work towards. And, some educators found a way within Common Core standards to incorporate a more constructive analysis where they compare AVE with standard English to help students navigate both language systems better. But, culturally responsive teaching is the method that really promotes a more inclusive approach to language because it includes students using books that are written in AVE that reflects their home dialect before translating into standard American English. And so it promotes code switching and translanguaging that, helps better, I think, increase and encourage students to shift between AVE and standard American English depending on the context. It also helps them navigate academic and professional spaces while maintaining their linguistic identity. And we did speak previously about how negative impacts of code switching can have in the long run. So that's why translanguaging or code meshing encourages students better to blend AAVE and standard American English in a more creative fashion in both their spoken and written communications. For example, that would be such as using AVE and formal English to write a poem that expresses identity and meaning, and that mixing creates a better linguistic understanding. So now let's talk about the strategic impact. And so what happens when you can't validate AVE in academic spaces, and rather than it's still it's dismissed, and students are going to suffer with engagement, with academic performance, and with identity formation. And so in order to combat that, you have to increase teacher training, increase policy reform that will lead to bias reduction, that leads to better classroom environments, that leads to a more systematic approach to incorporating AVE and educational improvements. And the reason this is important is because when students see their home language or dialect affirmed in the classroom, as we stated, it increases the engagement, increases the participation, increases confidence, and it allows AV speakers to be respected so they can contribute to discussions, feel comfortable in their academic spaces, and take ownership of their learning. And so that's the most important part about that. Those participation rates that are going to rise when AV speakers are championed, when they feel their dialect is not stigmatized or constantly corrected, so they don't disengage. Studies show that the teachers who don't understand AVE and don't have that higher literacy and comprehension skills are forcing students to abandon their dialect. And so they struggle because they feel disconnected in their own language patterns. And so the quantitative analysis, where you compare the AAVE to standard American English, better helps students understand grammatical rules, reading structures, and improves their writing skills. There was a research program that was done in Los Angeles that found students who received instruction in AV alongside Standard American English performed better on their reading comprehension test because they did not feel suppressed. And so that is one of the biggest challenges is how do you avoid this implicit bias in education? Well, you do that by ensuring that students and teachers are going to be meeting on the same, linguistic playing field when talking about how to better implement AAVE in academic tracking to avoid such things as remedial programs. But we talk about how our obstacles are going to be the pushback from school administrators and policymakers who are not going to see it as a legitimate dialect. And so that bias then trickles down into this testing that they're designing for students that are exclusively in Standard American English. And so we have to find a way to ensure that tests like the SATs, the ACTs, the state literacy exams don't fail to recognize dialectical proficiency because the students who speak fluently AAVE and SAE have to understand how to answer some dialect based questions without being penalized. And these linguistic mismatches are caused by the test because these tests aren't really looking to understand how a person is using the language. It's looking to really uphold adherence to standard American English, where you'll see AVE marked continuously as errors. And so there's a challenge in balancing that so that students can succeed. And, some critics have stated that, AVE usage will then lead students to be unprepared for professional and academic settings. And as we know in bilingual education, that could be no further from the truth because students are able to, like I said, code match and code switch. And so that means that we would need federal policies or even widely adopted state policies that can explicitly support AV speakers in education and in the professional setting. When they graduate and they're leaving their formal school training, they need to understand that they have these protections that will not, they will face discrimination in grading and classroom participation and assessments, in and out of work. These educational, state, and national frameworks are going to be the best way to ensure dialectal awareness in curriculums, in teacher training, and in the professional setting. And so, schools can voluntarily adopt the cultural responsive teaching in order to start that bridging of the gap. Now, despite these challenges that we mentioned, the previous programs that we talked about were successful in their own right and did demonstrate how AV can impact students' education in a beneficial way. So one thing we kept talking about is the bridging of AVE to Standard American English. And so if we look at the bridge program that was developed in Michigan in the 1970s, these books and materials that were written in both AV and Standard American English help students to transition from their home dialect to their academic English or standardized English. And so the quantitative analysis approach meant that students were being taught both AAVE and Standard American English grammar and pronunciation and how they differed from each other to respect both. And students that were in this bridge program showed a significant improvement in their reading comprehension when compared to their peers that were only taught in traditional English only. Um, you know, so this starts an understanding of what the future linguistic programs can look like when they are dialect based. Even the Oakland and Bonnet resolution that was, widely lauded, and a lot of external opposition, when in spaces where it was adopted, the program itself was highly effective in improving reading levels among AAVE speakers. And the teachers actually reported better student engagement and participation in classes. And so this demonstrated not only the power of AAVE and linguistic diversity, but also the power of policy advocacy, how you can spark those national conversations. So you fast forward now to New York City, and they've become a leader in critically responsive teaching. Using and recognizing AAVE in the classrooms, New York has adopted this curriculum that incorporates literature, oral storytelling, and culturally relevant texts that have this bilingual style teaching model. And so the students are taught AAVE alongside Standard American English. And so they have been reported higher literacy scores among their African American students. They have higher levels of classroom participation, as we mentioned. And it's more of a modern example of how AAVE's inclusive teaching strategies can be successfully implemented in larger school districts specifically. So when you're looking at these larger scale educational systems, it's like, how do we continue this momentum and further implement these strategies? Well, first you have to, and most essentially, create the curriculum that's going to recognize and incorporate AAVE rather than treating it as an obstacle to overcome. So falling back on that cognitive analysis and the critically relevant literature where AAVE can be included in reading materials that validate students' linguistic identities. Teachers' training is also important because they should be trained in the grammar, the pronunciation, and the structure of AAVE so they can recognize it as not being broken English and further innovate workshops and activities that help incorporate it in their teaching methods, such as translanguaging. And it also helps with bias reduction training because teachers begin to unlearn these very harmful assumptions that they have about AAVE speakers, and it allows to promote more equitable teaching practices when you root out this unconscious bias in the grading and the assessments and in the student interactions. So once you do that, we need to look at the educational policies because linguistic diversity is not something that's just going to come on its own. It has to be instructed. And so acknowledging that prevents discrimination based on dialect. So state and federal education policies have to explicitly state AAVE awareness in their literary initiatives. Improving these legal protections and supporting AAVE students will create an equitable assessment and literacy instruction in public schools. Because education doesn't happen in isolation. Parents, families, communities all need to come together and play their critical role in language learning. And schools need to engage the parents in conversation about AAVE and linguistic diversity. The community programs need to partner with Black organizations that include AAVE-friendly approaches to encourage reading and writing in and out of school settings. And through this home and school collaboration, AAVE students can feel more supported in both spaces. It's going to create a network of support where, AAVE inclusive education reforms can further flourish. So we did cover a lot today. And, I want to continue the discussion about exploring history, policy challenges, and strategic solutions on including AAVE in the educational setting. So I'm going to leave you with these few guiding questions. Wrap up today's session. I would love to hear your thoughts, concerns, all of that. I'll leave you with this quote today. Understand that ultimately language is going to be power. And so recognizing AAVE in education is not just us teaching students how to speak, but empowering them to navigate the world with confidence, with pride, and with linguistic versatility. And I just want to thank you guys all for participating in this conversation. I look forward to any comments that's left on the website or the TikTok, the YouTube. I'd love to hear your thoughts about what stood out most about today's discussion for you. And as always, breathe deeply, move gently, and drink your water. Here's my contact information if you have any further questions. Like I said, you can reach me on the website at adventuresinn.com or at my email. Thank you.